public hearing today, where we hope to hear from all interested parties and members of the public who wish to present remarks. My name is Gordon Campbell. I'm the chair of the New York City Board of Corrections, and I'd like my colleagues to introduce themselves. And Jennifer, we'll start with you.
Jennifer Jones Alston.
I'm Derek C.
Bobby Cohen.
Good morning, Brian Campbell.
Michael Regan.
Steve Safier.
And a special thanks to Commissioner Bassett for the Department of Health and Mental Health and her staff for making this auditorium available, and also to the Board of Corrections staff who worked tirelessly to pull off this hearing today. Pursuant to the city charter, the Board of Corrections establishes and ensures compliance with minimum standards regulating conditions of confinement and correctional health and mental health care in all city correctional facilities. The regulation proposed to the board for its consideration would create a new enhanced supervision unit and reform the use of punitive segregation. This proposal clearly comes at a time of transition for New York City jails. The board has been working on the punitive segregation issues for 2.5 years, and in that time, the number of punitive segregation beds in our system has dropped from 1,000 to 578. However, violence, both inmate and inmate, and officer and inmate use of force have continued to climb. This is happening in a time when our incarcerated population is low. In fact, much lower than 20 years ago. It is a real problem, and one that we must work together to solve. The board has received written comments which are available on our website. We look forward to hearing testimony today from city officials and interested parties. Your input and expertise is hugely important to the decisions we must make as a board, and we thank you. And as we stated at our last board meeting, the rule before us today is not the rule we will ultimately adopt on January 13th, which makes your input invaluable. Today we have a large number of people, in fact over 60, who indicated that they wish to testify. As a result, we're going to be limiting testimony to 5 minutes each. We have a timekeeper, Jay Park, in the front that will help keep us on schedule. And then following each speaker, board members will have an opportunity to ask questions. In terms of the order of testimony, it's the order in which individuals signed up. One thing that's really important, we ask that you listen respectfully to all speakers, hold your applause, and your commentary. This meeting is being videotaped, and the video transcript will be available shortly on our website. I note the restrooms are to your right as you exit the back door, and pursuant to Department of Health and Mental Health regulation, because this is a public laboratory, no photos or videos can be taken except for a videographer and the press. I will announce each speaker and also the speaker immediately following, and that individual can actually sit right there in the third row. And with that, we will turn it over to our first speaker, who is Commissioner Joseph Pond, Commissioner of the Department of Correction, to be immediately followed by City Council Member Daniel Drum. Commissioner.
Water. Good morning, Board Chairman. My pleasure to be here this morning to kind of restate what I stated at the prior board meeting as I talked about enhanced supervision of our city jail system. Speaker working?
Yes.
I know I have already had a chance to describe enhanced supervised housing to you, but I wanted to speak today because I have heard so many misconceptions about this new unit that I thought it would be helpful to provide clarification. I know the public has a lot to say about ESH, and I want to hear all of their concerns. But just briefly, I want to try to help correct some of those misconceptions. Finding effective solutions to the violence that has long persisted in the jails requires innovative problem-solving and comprehensive overhaul in a way we train our staff and manage the diverse needs of the inmate population. The department is embarking on transformative changes with the modernization of our inmate management system and program approaches. To date, we have made significant and meaningful reforms. We have implemented a 15-to-1 inmate-to-officer ratio in our adolescent units. we are working with Friends of Island Academy to create discharge planning programming for adolescents. In September 2014, we began a program in partnership with two nonprofit organizations, Animal Care and Control, Instinct Dog Behavior and Training, as well as DOH-MH, to train dogs at risk of being euthanized. We are in discussions with DOE to expand the career and technical education curriculum. We continue to provide moral recognition therapy. On September 2nd, we created Second Chance Housing, where adolescents in punitive segregation who have behaved well and have not injured staff or other inmates may be moved prior to the expiration of their sentences in order to facilitate their transition back to general population. On December 4th, we ended punitive segregation for adolescents with the creation of a transitional repair unit. In May, we went from 82 adolescents in punitive segregation to 0 in December. We adopted a simple policy change to reduce violence throughout the institutions by an early lock-in of 2,100 hours at all of our facilities. To effectuate fundamental change in facility management, the department evaluated the recruit and training of staff to ensure that every staff at every level had the skills to address the diverse needs of the inmate population. Recently, our investigative unit, internal affairs unit, implemented and initiated a full-time 5-member unit at RNDC, our adolescent unit. We've also added recently a same 5-member team to GRVC, second most violent facility at Rikers Island. As part of our long-term goals, the department will be implementing full camera coverage throughout the entire island. Violence in our jails is at an all-time high. The goal of ESH is to improve the safety and security in our jails. We are not looking to create a backdoor punitive segregation unit. Quite the contrary. Our goal has been to reduce the agency's reliance on punitive segregation as a tool for day-to-day inmate management. But we have a responsibility to do this in a way that is safe for all involved, staff and inmates. ESH is in line with our changes to the use of punitive segregation. The department's punitive segregation reform strategy includes ceasing the practice of enforcing historical time for punitive seg. However, if someone returns to custody with a violent history, he can be housed in ESH. I don't want to have any misconceptions on that. We're also reducing the sentence that can be handed out for any one infraction from 90 days to 30 days. Punitive segregation is a useful tool for discipline, but best practices from across the country show that for the most violent inmates, the best approach is to minimize their contact with general population while the risks of violence are high, and provide evidence-based programming to help modify behavior and mainstream them back to population. To that end, we are planning to implement programs to inmates in ESH that have been generally effective in other correctional systems across the country, like interactive journaling programs that's used in the Virginia Department of Corrections. In fact, the Challenge Journaling Program, which we have looked at, has been successful in Virginia, and it's been implemented there for years, and has a 3-phase, 8-step program that focuses on violence reduction and keeping high-risk inmates engaged in pro-social behavior. As I have noted previously, we examined violent indicators and change in our average daily population. We see subpopulations that are driving the violence in our jails. High custody inmates make up 16% of our average daily population and are responsible for 61% of the violent incidents in our facilities. Mental health inmates make up 33% of our average daily population and account for 53% of the violence in our jails. Gang members make up 15% of our population and account for 25% of our violent incidents. And inmates who are involved in violent incidents are typically the longer-term inmates that are staying with us on average of 262 days.
Commissioner, 1 minute, please. Thank you.
The key is that these groups, which comprise relatively small segments of the total population, have disproportionate incident involvement and require different management approaches. But I want to be clear that serious mentally ill will not be placed in ESH. As we have already do for SMI, that have infractions, they will be placed in our CAPS and PACE units. We will not use ESH for 16 and 17-year-olds. Where there are other safe housing options that bring necessary treatment and programming, we will use them instead of ESH. But it is incumbent upon us to do what we can to keep our staff and inmates safe in our jails as safe as possible. Data demonstrates that involvement in serious violent incidents is often a good predictor of future violence. 71% of our use of force incidents in FY14 involved repeat offenders. That means out of 3,779 use of forces, 2,694 were inmates that have been involved in the use of force prior. Similarly, in FY15, we see 64% of our use of forces are driven by repeat offenders. These are significant numbers. It is possible that as many as 2,979 incidents could have been prevented had we had a system in place to better manage these assaultive inmates. As we know, a relatively small number of only 7% of our inmates in custody are violent, assaultive, or present a clear danger to others. And we need to have a way to separate and manage them in a more effective manner. Inmates in these units will have at least 7 hours out of cell time per day in a socialized environment. ESH is a necessary tool to safely house violent inmates. And it is a non-punitive setting with some common sense restrictions which limit opportunities to cause harm. It will also limit influential gang leaders who direct and initiate assaults. I'll stop there to take questions.
Thank you, Commissioner. I'll open up to board members for questions. Brian?
Good morning, Commissioner. Thank you so much. First, I just want to say I really applaud the reforms that you have made at Rikers on behalf of the youth that are incarcerated there at RNDC. And I know you and I have the pleasure of having a conversation about a week ago when I had gone out to Rikers to confirm that solitary confinement had in fact ended for youth. And as we had discussed, I had learned about a unit that the Board of Correction had not been informed about, and that's the unit you all are calling the Transitional Repair Unit for 16 and 17-year-olds. And at that time, we had a discussion, and I just want to confirm that with you. With respect to the TRU unit, is there still no policy directive written about that unit?
So we're working on policy. As I mentioned at the time, we've sent staff to other locations. Particularly, this program is something we're adopting from Massachusetts. So we're looking at their policies and writing those here. So there is not a policy specific to that unit as we speak today.
Okay. And a week ago when I was there and toured with Deputy Glenn, I was informed that the lockout is only 4 hours a day, 2 hours in the morning and 2 hours in the afternoon. And the reason I'm asking is because it's highly related to the ending of punitive segregation, these proposed rules, and whether or not this might be something that's like an adolescent ESHU. Is in fact the lockout still just 4 hours per day?
No, I'm not sure. I won't comment as to what it is today. We had in excess of 60 plus kids in punitive segregation in July. We have 0 today. When we get down to the final number of those kids in this unit, which I think is 7 or 8 out of 60, so it is a progressive process to bring those kids back into full, out of cell time and full programming. It doesn't happen overnight, and it is a progression of gradually increasing out of cell time and interaction with staff, and eventually into full programming in school and every place else. So it is not intended to be a set hour or number of hours. It is intended to be a step-by-step process that gradually introduces these kids back.
Right, so let me just follow up on that. You are aware that the Board of Correction minimum standards mandate that inmates be locked out 14 hours a day unless they're in a special unit, and the special unit for the adolescents would be a solitary confinement unit, correct?
Yes.
So, and the lockout, if it were still the 20-hour, lock-in was still the 20 hours, and according to the proposed rules, and even the RHU, policy directive, that would essentially still constitute a form of punitive segregation pursuant to the Board of Correction rules, correct?
I disagree. So it doesn't meet any of the other criteria for punitive segregation. It's a gradual process. I think the board would be in taking a poor position to not allow us a transitional period to get to where we need to go. I mean, we're talking about 50 or 60 adolescents out of a population of 230 that were in punitive segregation, some of them for hundreds of days. Most of these kids that we're talking about still owe hundreds of days of punitive segregation. So the transition of 4 or 5, 6 hours out of cell time, I think is appropriate. And we use that same model, I'd like to remind the board, in our CAPS unit. So those inmates are put in cell time for periods of time as they misbehave. In this case, we're trying to transition kids out. So
let me just say, everything that I've heard about it sounds like the program will be excellent. My question really is it in compliance with the Board of Correction standards? And if it's a lockout of less than 14 hours, is it essentially either some form of punitive segregation? Would you be surprised to hear that the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene says that this is still operating as essentially an RHU for adolescents 16 and 17 that have mental illness and need to be?
I met with Mary Bassett last week. Mr. Bassett, she made no mention of that. So if it was a concern for DOHMH, I'd be more than happy to have that conversation with her.
So let me open it up. Our other
I
board
just
members.
have 1 or 2 questions more about it. I understand that the ratio of officer to inmate is 1 officer for 2 inmates. Is that correct?
It will be whatever's needed. I mean, it's a treatment model. Some kids it's 1-on-1, some kids it's 2-on-1, and some kids it's 4 or 5. So my direction to the warden and Chief Perino is that we need to put the appropriate staffing numbers to manage the behavior outside of the cell. So it's a process for them to figure out what works best with the population they're dealing with. So it could be, it could be 1-to-1 in that unit.
My last question is, are there selection criteria in process hearings that these youth are entitled to?
So as pertains to these kids, they've all been adjudicated and sentenced to punitive seg time. It's our process to work out of that. So, I guess I would ask the board's indulgence to say, isn't it better to be working in this direction than to be, having hundreds of days of punitive seg time hanging over somebody's head? We have worked to zero. We stopped sentencing any adolescents to punitive seg months ago. This is the last group. This is a tough group of kids. They've had repeated assaults on each other, repeated assaults on staff. It is a difficult, tough process for staff to get them back to where they need to be. And I think they're doing a great job in that regard.
Jennifer?
Commissioner Pond, you began your testimony by saying that there were several points, misconceptions that needed to be clarified. I just want to ask, are there any additional points that you'd like to make concerning any misconceptions that are out there?
Yeah, so, I mean, I've met with a lot of groups this past week, and as of last night, we had other meetings. So, yeah, so this is not a lockdown unit. Inmates are allowed to gather in smaller groups, which is about 24, 25. They can go to showers, they can go to rec, they're not moved in restraints other than outside the unit. There's a due process to get in, which means that there's a hearing for an inmate who we'd like to place in there. We've changed the policy that there was some concern that an officer could take an inmate and place him in this unit. We've now required that only a deputy warden can even recommend. There's a hearing, and there's a deputy warden in charge of the unit, which will review every placement. There's also the ability of the inmate to petition after placement to be reviewed to get out. And we've been put into the policy a 60-day review on everybody that's physically in the unit. So those are much different than you would find in a punitive seg setting. Thank you.
Mark, just clarification, so the 60-day review, does that mean to say that the minimum stay in EHU would be 60 days? Is that what that leads to?
No, because the inmate can petition on their own for review.
Okay.
So they can, first they can appeal the initial placement, then if that still happens, they then can petition a review earlier than 60 days. But there'll be a 60-day review irregardless if the inmate requests or not.
Bobby?
A couple of questions for Commissioner. When I spoke with you last week, I was concerned and asked you a question and asked it again about the need for the reduction, modification of Board Standard 1.05, which calls for a 14-hour lockout. I asked you at that time if the staffing was what you had intended, staffing available to you was what you want in the ESH units, and there were 25 detainees in this unit. Would that be adequate safety for you? And you replied at the time that it would be, but it was a question of efficiency. I was wondering if you would still say that today.
Yes, I mean, there is, we are all taxpayers. I think I said that at the time we met. And the fact that, a staffing plan is 25 inmates to 4 officers, all out of cell time. And the other issue for us is availability, that, we'd have cell blocks that would be half empty. And I'm not sure if we had cell space to even accommodate that.
As we both agreed at that time, one of the most important solutions to a lot of the problems on Rikers Island would be a substantial reduction in the population of prisoners in New York City. We hope to help you achieve that. It's obviously not completely in either of our hands. I have 2 other brief questions. One is that you stated in the rule that you presented to us that you were aware that the nature of neurobiological science suggests that 16 and 17-year-olds are at great risk of medical and mental health harm for being in solitary confinement. As of yesterday, according to the Board of Corrections staff, there were 53 18-year-olds in solitary confinement on Rikers Island out of a population of 200, which is a percentage, around 25% of 18-year-olds in solitary confinement. And when I was out on Rikers Island last week, I met a young man who was in solitary confinement in one of the in GRDC in the RHU. He had been there for seven days. He'd been transferred from RNDC because he's aged out. He was no longer 16, where he'd spent all this time in solitary confinement, except for the period he was at Bellevue Hospital. When he was 17, he spent his time in solitary confinement, and now that he's 18, he's going to spend his time in solitary confinement. I know that was an issue that the U.S. Attorney raised yesterday. Why is it necessary to have 18-year-olds in solitary confinement, and even 19, 20, and 21-year-olds, given their frailty relative to mental health implications of solitary?
When you say is it necessary, I think there are alternatives. As we looked at the work that we did at RNDC, there was months of work. We did what most systems would take years to do in months. As we looked at the next segment of this population, as everyone is aware, the law in New York changed, or 18-year-olds are now adults. So that's a change in the system. What we've done, and we've talked about that when we met, is to look at a subgroup of inmates, 18 to 21, and that's about 1,200, and then develop a program very similar to the work we did in RNDC, which eventually eliminates most punitive seg. Now, there's no system in the country that I'm aware of that's working with young adults that has done that. And it's innovative. I think it's doable. It's just a much bigger process to happen, and that's, as we talked, we'll be submitting to the Board of Corrections our plan on how to do that.
One last question. In the rule that you proposed to us, you said that at some time in the future, based upon progress, you would make the maximum sentence for an infraction 30 days. Is there some reason why 30 days makes sense to you rather than 15 days, which is the international standard on solitary confinement for those who are over 21 and not mentally ill?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if there's an acceptable national standard, and I've heard that number. When I say acceptable, where in corrections somehow that's happening. I think the 30-day punitive seg limit that we're imposing on ourselves is pretty good as most correctional standards, and pretty good is never good enough to me. So we ought to be effective in our management. So if it's 1 day and it works, we should do 1 day. If 30 days is too much, we should look at that. But it's all about managing the behavior, and that's kind of why we're talking about these units. We're trying to manage inmate behavior safely. So I'm not stuck on a number of days. If violence goes down, or our institutions get safe, and our staff are safer, and our inmates are better treated, then we'll work to whatever number that is.
Just with respect to that, I know since you've arrived, we've been talking about solitary confinement reform, and we had reached some agreement as to what that would look like for you, and you had agreed, as Dr. Cohen just said, to reduce it down to, for any grade 1 offenses, 30 days, grade 2 offenses, punitive seg light, and grade 3 offenses, no punitive seg. Since there is a proposed rule before the board that was proposed by DOC that we have adopted as our own, that only has currently 2 limitations on punitive seg, that being 16 and 17-year-olds in owed time, are you agreeing that we add these earlier agreed upon and announced reforms to this rule now as we go forward?
As a package, yes.
What does that mean?
There's the EHS units and the overall reform. I think they all work well together.
Okay, so you're sure.
Yes.
And when you just follow that up with respect to exclusions, and we've had a lot of conversation about exclusions from punitive seg as well as exclusions from the ESHU, because right now there's very little in the proposed rule that talks about exclusions. Can you tell us what you are agreeing to regarding the exclusions in these 2 units regarding mental illness, physical illness, developmental disabilities, traumatic brain injury?
When you say 2 units, I don't understand.
Well, the ESHU and the punitive seg, because your proposed bill, which we've adopted for CAPA, is talking about the ESHU and considering exclusions for that unit, as well as punitive seg, and considering exclusions, since you listed 2, then we may wish to expand on those exclusions.
So DOH-MH still has the same authority and ability to exclude anybody based on medical or mental health concerns. They have the legal authority to do that. So we're not, as far as we create this unit, which is much less than any impact that punitive seg has, they still have that ability. So seriously mentally ill is a bit easier definition because it's pretty well defined. It's about 78% of the population. We got good practice here in the city of New York where when we use our CAPS units, it's very effective and treatment orientated. We'll be going into our PACE units, which is a prior infraction but higher clinical treatment. All those things are good. So the issue is that they will exclude in the same manner for here as they would anywhere else. I mean, that's kind of a DOH-MH decision. We're working with them on defining that some, but they still have the legal authority to do that.
Derek?
Yes, sir. What was your cross-section on the availability of contact visits for inmates in the ESU?
Right. So our thoughts are based on inmate behavior. So if it's smuggling and contraband, drugs, violence, a lot of violence is driven by other kinds of activities. It could be strong arming, it could be drug activity, it could be any kind of influence in the facility. So our belief is that we start off in these units with non-contact visits and allow inmates an opportunity through good behavior to earn those visits back, even within this unit. So it's a process that when we start off, we're having the most restrictive environment and allow an inmate to earn their way back to what we would allow contact visits. So for many of the incidents that happen where somebody cuts somebody or seriously assaults somebody, that's the outcome of other things. It could be a drug activity, it could be influence, it could be yang. So what we wanted to do is really restrict that, one, until we figure that out and make sure that the inmate's back on track before we start loosening up any of those restrictions.
So we think they would have to sort of earn as opposed to doing something
Right.
that would take it away.
That's correct.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Commissioner, you just said a few moments ago that you would agree to the reform of punitive seg if the ESHU is approved. Can you just explain to me the reason? Because I'm struggling to figure it out. I understand there's about 600 inmates in punitive seg, and I understand that when we talked last week about the number of inmates that you thought were really dangerous, that had to go into ESHU, we're talking about 150, maybe 200.
Right.
Why is one tied to the other, especially since correctional experts generally agree that the heavy use of solitary confinement contributes to the culture of violence?
Okay, so we're tying a couple of things together. So this isn't solitary confinement, number one. There is no definition that anyone could pull and say, this program is solitary confinement.
No, I'm talking
number
about
one.
punitive segment
Right,
one.
okay.
Sorry.
So this is a piece of inmate management. I mean, we don't get all this violence that happens in the jail by accident. So this is a piece of overall inmate management. Today, we have 1,000 inmates who've been adjudicated through the disciplinary process who are not in punitive seg, yet they owe punitive seg time. So the basic process, and the only one we have right now, to manage inmates, just doesn't work. Because the idea is you do something wrong, you go for a hearing, and you get days in punitive seg, and you go to punitive seg, serve your time, and come out. There are 1,000 inmates that have been adjudicated that don't go. So part of this reform is to clean that up, so if you do something serious, you are going to go to punitive seg, and that's safe for everybody. And if you continue to be dangerous, you're going to go to these units so we can manage you more effectively. It's called enhanced supervision, which means there's more staff to inmate than normal. So the issue is why it ties together is because by separating this dangerous group out, we'll be better able to manage the rest. I mean, that's conceptually how it works. So it's a piece of inmate management, not like one thing. So that's why it's kind of tied together conceptually. So.
Michael? I just want to congratulate you. I feel that there's a culture of reform here. I feel that there are things happening, and I've been on the board a long time. I think that there's things happening. I watched very attentively what the mayor announced on Rikers Island earlier this week. I feel there's a culture of reform, and you should be congratulated. I think Bobby's spot on that the 18-year-old population, the 25% is unacceptable. But I'm looking forward to hearing what the advocates and others say. But I think there's a culture of reform.
Thank you.
I just have a question. Commissioner, don't get me wrong, I agree, and I'd like to see what you've done for that expand to all of Rikers. We have been advised.
And I agree with that also. So.
Yes. And I know that's what you're trying to do. Since you say it is a package, let me just ask you here. We've been informed by Corporation Counsel that they would be recommending that we have a sunset provision in these rules, that we approve it for a year, but essentially have a sunset provision to reevaluate it based on evidence-based practices and metrics. Would you agree to that?
Great idea. If this doesn't work, it's not good for any of us. I mean, if we say this is going to reduce violence and doesn't reduce, I mean, it's not good for any of us. I think where we get common ground with everybody I've talked to is that do we want to make the jail safer? I mean, if this helps us do that, I think we're okay. And nobody I've talked to said, gee, that's a bad idea. Let's leave it like it is. So this is just a piece of that. But I agree, Your Honor, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you. We're now going to hear from
Thank you.
Councilmember Daniel Drum, and then following next week will be James Lorenzo, First Deputy Commissioner, Department of Correction. And Councilmember, welcome, and you have 5 minutes to get out of 90 speakers. And there's someone keeping time right in front of you. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you. My name is Daniel Drum, and I'm a member of the New York City Council and chair of the Committee on Education. Throughout my tenure, I have become increasingly involved in efforts to reform our city's jails. Seeing the impact of prolonged and isolated confinement has fueled my passion around this issue. A friend who was struggling with drug addiction and mental health issues found himself at Rikers Island. After being caught with contraband, cigarettes in this case, he found himself in punitive segregation, devoid of social contact and programming he so critically needed to maintain his sanity and his recovery. The torture he endured took a devastating toll. This young man emerged from these periods of isolation and deprivation a hollow shell of his former self. Like so many others who have endured extreme and continued isolation, he is now withdrawn, anxious, and hypersensitive. He has difficulty with concentration and memory, and he experiences unpredictable fluctuations in temperament. I do not believe the Department of Corrections proposal for enhanced supervised housing will adequately address the dire need for comprehensive reform. Instead, for comprehensive reform. Instead of heeding the loud cries for reform coming from the Department of Justice, the United States Civil Rights Commission, the New York Times, and seasoned advocates, the Department of Correction has proposed the creation of another category of highly restrictive housing that will exist together with the current punitive segregation regime. The department claims that ESH is not supposed to be punitive. However, the details of the plan suggest otherwise. As with punitive segregation, adjudicators will not be truly independent since they are fellow corrections officers. Independent attorneys and advocates will not be allowed to provide critical representation. In addition to the lack of these due process protections, ESH raises two more serious concerns. First, unlike individuals with a fixed punitive segregation sentence, individuals are sent to ESH indefinitely without any clearly delineated path to release or less restrictive conditions. Second, a specific infraction is not needed to land in ESH. The threshold is much too broad and low, leaving the process open to abuse. I ask that the Board of Corrections seize the opportunity to enact meaningful reform. Perhaps with much revision, ESH could largely replace punitive segregation. It should start as a pilot, be closely monitored along with the appropriate metrics, and be reviewed periodically for outcomes. ESH, as well as the minimum standards this board is drafting, must rein in the rampant abuses in our city's jails. I would like to draw your attention to a recently released report from the New York Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, which flatly states that punishment of youth under 25, as Member Cohen has mentioned, in jails and prisons constitutes cruel and unusual punishment under the Eighth Amendment. I will repeat that what I stated before, that this committee, the committee about the liberal use of solitary confinement as a management tool. The imposition of severe isolation for infractions unrelated to safety concerns seems to serve no purpose other than to brutalize prisoners. The department needs to reorient its entire model. Facilities with well-trained staff should prepare individuals for release from day one and address safety concerns through methods that are proven to reduce violence. Regardless of the unit, programming and individual treatment are vitally important. Unfortunately, the ESH proposal lacks this key element. CAPS and the Second Chance Unit at Rikers seem to provide a good start, but must be expanded. And finally, federal authorities have understandably grown impatient with the city's slow reaction to the uncovering of grave constitutional and human rights violations. I therefore urge this board to act without delay to put to rest one of the ugliest chapters in our city's history by enacting far-reaching reform in close consultation with the experts, many of whom are here with us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilman. Our next speaker is First Deputy Commissioner James Lorenda, followed by Martin Murphy, Acting Chief of the Department.
Good morning, Chair Campbell and members of the Board of Corrections. My name is James Lorenda. I'm the First Deputy Commissioner for the New York City Department of Corrections. I've been a member of the New York City Department of Corrections since October of 2014. Prior to this, I served as Commissioner for the Connecticut Department of Correction under current Governor Daniel Malloy, and proudly served in all custody ranks within the department for 27 years. I also attained a Bachelor of Science degree in biochemistry, a Master's in business, and I sat on many isolation and segregation panels around the country. Most recently, 2014 National Sentencing Commission, and also the 2014 Lyman Center Colloquium at the Yale University, with many in attendance from around the world. I visited and studied procedures in over 32 different punitive and administrative segregation units around the country. These included the ADX Supermax Federal Correctional Institution in Florence, Colorado, Colorado Department of Correction, Texas Department of Correction, Pennsylvania Department of Correction, New Jersey Department of Correction, Terre Haute Federal Death Row in Indiana, and Florida Department of Correction, to just name a few. I have assisted in partnership with the Connecticut Civil Liberties Union and the Yale University Law School in researching programs and effects of isolation and segregation of incarcerated individuals. The proposed enhanced supervision housing of offenders being allowed out of their cells for 7 hours each day is not isolation segregation. The only perception of segregation is the separation of these violent offenders from nonviolent population. hence allowing the New York City Department of Correction the authority to protect nonviolent offenders. The general population cell housing in the Connecticut Department of Correction only allows out offenders out of their cells 6 to 7 hours each day for any offender serving time. Those of this violent nature that we're proposing only come out in Connecticut 2 to 5 hours each day with very structured and effective programming, preparing them each day for return back into their community. I urge you to understand the safe and structured enhanced supervision housing proposal will not only decrease the current violence throughout the system, but keep these offenders safe from each other. Nobody, including the correctional staff, want to see any more offenders hurting anyone or themselves. This proposal will just be one step closer to reducing violence and allowing non-violent offenders to be protected and feel safe in their current and unfortunate environment. This structured proposal is not a new concept throughout the country. It is not a form of punishment or harassment, for it is providing a more secure and safe environment for staff and offenders. We cannot continue our current path of allowing these offenders from threatening, assaulting, and extorting nonviolent offenders. It will help each other teach them respect and dignity. It'll also reward them to return to population for subsequent good behavior and program completion. At this time, I want to thank you for listening to this very important and necessary proposal.
Bobby? Welcome to New York.
Thank you, Doctor.
So, this is a proposal to decrease violence on Rikers Island, and having been on the board for the past 5 years and worked in and around Rikers Island for the past 30, I was surprised that there was nothing in this proposal which talks about violence by the officer staff directed towards the prisoners. It specifically states there should be no training. There's no training necessary in the response that we got from the department this week, where we can't ask the question about training. We're told there's absolutely no need for any additional training. The police department seems to think that they have a need for some additional training on these issues. I was really surprised to see that, and would like to know why that's the case. And the second question, if you could, has to do with contact visits that was also raised by Derek Zepis, that we know that there's lots of contraband in terms of weapons and drugs that are coming into the prison through the officer staff. When I go through, as of last week, when I walk onto Rikers Island, I've been there 3 times in the past 5 weeks. Things go up. I'm not searched. I offer to put my my coat and wooden-like metal objects onto the belt, and staff say just go through a board of correction. I really think that when prisoners, as you know, are strip searched before and after their visits, family members go through wanding for molecules. They go through metal detectors. They are pat frisked if necessary. I've not heard any explanations for why contact visits are not allowed. And as you know, as the Corporation Council has told you, there's a requirement in New York State that people have a right to contact visits, and they should not be denied as a policy, which is what you're doing. Thank you. I'm
glad you brought that up. The weapons of choice with an offender in the New York City Department is different from I've ever seen around the country. The choice weapon is a scalpel. I have never heard that in my life. The scalpels that they use in the New York City Department of Correction do not get picked up on metal detectors. We even brought it to TSA. We brought it to other states, brought it to even the company for the metal detector. They do not get it detected because if you use a small amount of electrical tape with a small scalpel, it won't get picked up anywhere. No strip search in the country is going to teach us to be able to detect these scalpels that are inside the orifices or the anuses of these individuals. It's not going to be picked up. That is one scary thing for these inmates. Now, I'm not talking about even just the staff, how scary it is, but the nonviolent offenders that have to get subjected to this. When the nonviolent offenders get subjected to things like this, they turn violent because they have to. They have to protect themselves. They have to also get scalpels because they're going to protect themselves against the violent offenders that have them. When you have visitors that are on top of each other during a visit, literally on top of each other, I don't know if you've witnessed the visits that happen. They're not a brief brace, hug, and kiss before and after a visit like I've seen around the country for contact visits. They're on top of each other. They pass things and they put things in their orifices. That's reality. I could have incidents after incidents. I could show you that this is happening. When that happens, inmates have their own armory. When they have their own armory, they go prepared into these units for war. And what happens is who gets victimized are the nonviolent offenders because they have to start protecting themselves or they're going to be victimized. Things like this and with the non-contacts will prevent that stuff. They will prevent it. The correction officers don't want these weapons in there. They're going to be used against them too. Or even the blood that happens with the transfer with hepatitis C. They don't want this stuff. I don't care who or how bad you are of a correction officer. You don't want this stuff to happen. The way you stop that, the contact visits that are bringing these things in, the visitors that are coming in, they're not even approved. They're not even a pre-approved process. The visitors don't even know half these inmates they're visiting. They're being threatened and extorted in the community to bring items in for inmates they don't even know. That is so scary to me and so absurd that we allow these things to occur in the Department of Correction that introduce contraband into the facility. We're doing a better job at the entrances for anyone coming in, visitor, and it's not just staff. We have a lot of volunteers, a lot of organizations that come through that front door. We're doing a better job. Do we have to do better? Yes. We need better equipment, better x-ray machines, better metal detectors. Those things will come. We need a better process, a better looks and supervision of even the officers doing that at the front door. But the biggest concern right now are these contact visits on how they're getting scalpels into these facilities. It scares me. It scares those nonviolent offenders. It has to be one of our priorities. It has to be.
I just have a quick question.
Yeah.
Yeah, on this very point. So, assuming what you just said is accurate, how do you then, with regard to any member, any inmate who's in BSH, how do you move from no contact visits to allowing some contact visits? What is going to be the process for that, assuming that the situation is as you described?
Now, I'll go back to general correctional practices that all of us should know. If you take everything away from an offender, they have nothing to lose. If you give an inmate everything, they have nothing to gain. So what you do is when you have these units where you have incentives for inmates for behavior to be able to behave, that's when you start correcting behavior. And you have to be able to prove to an inmate when they do something well that they will get something out of it. Non-contact visits, getting rid of it permanently is not a good idea. Giving them incentives to keep getting them or get them is a better idea to me. You behave, you stop the violence, you listen to the officers, you go to your program that we're telling you to, we'll start giving you periodic visits. It doesn't even have to be contact visits permanent. Periodic, so that the inmate has a reason to continue their behavior. And we want that good behavior. Everybody does. And I'm telling you, even the nonviolent offenders will start feeling that when they have these incentives and they could behave. They're watching the nonviolent offenders around them starting to behave. We'll start creating an environment that's better for even them. And we have to start doing that. What we're doing now with having nonviolent offenders out in population with the violent ones is dangerous to everybody. And it's not going to stop the violence unless we do something about it. I'm telling you, when we do this and we correct some of our visiting procedures, you will see the violence go down. If we don't, we'll go back to the way it is, but we're not in a good place right now. We have to start doing something.
Jennifer.
Thank you. I understand from your testimony that there will be the possibility of step down from the ESHU to general population. Can you shed some light on how that would occur? Would that occur with the review at the 60-day? What would be the assessment criteria? Can you provide some insight on that?
Okay, first of all, I didn't say anything in my testimony. There will be a step down, but I think there needs to be.
I inferred that when you said that there is the possibility.
For contact visits.
No, in your testimony, if I understand you correctly, you talked about maybe there being that possibility that you could go back to the general population.
Correct.
What I want to understand
I gotcha.
is what would be involved in that assessment and when would it occur?
Now, when you talk about inmate behavior, everything has to be individualized. Every inmate's different on how they behave and how they act. When you individualize a plan for an offender and you give that offender the opportunity for a certain period to behave and to comply with staff and go to programs, there has to be some type of an award. Giving them just contact visits won't be enough of an award, because now if they keep getting contact visits, what do I do better? The better thing is to get you into population safely, back into general population, and start getting everything everybody else has. But we have to be able to, you can't, like what the commissioner was talking about, you going right from punitive segregation to general population is a dangerous thing to do. There has to be step downs of all these different units we have. You can't just go from one end to the extreme to another and expect these offenders to do well. There has to be transitions, there has to be trial periods, there has to be incentives for those inmates to do well in that transition or in the general population status.
And with those step downs or the consideration thereof be made at the 60-day review?
Absolutely. And it doesn't even have to, the 60-day review is just a mandatory review time. It doesn't have to happen at the 60 days. If an inmate's doing really well, behaving really well, listening to staff, finished a program, oh, you got to wait for your 60 days? No. That should happen all the time. If someone really is doing well, they should be able to do X, Y, and Z for their good behavior. The 60 days is just a minimum mandatory time that we would look at doing the reviews.
Ryan?
Yeah, so let me just follow up on some of what you're saying. So, and I do commend the Commissioner and Department of Correction on all the programming you're doing for the youth, and much of this is anti-violence programming, right? And the ESHU is designated for those most dangerous inmates. What type of programming are you going to be offering during that 7 hours out of cell that would help in, let's say, community building, some forms of group therapy, cognitive behavioral, anti-violence program, to help them succeed in earning back those privileges and also being able to move out?
Your Honor, first of all, you're exactly right. In Connecticut, for these type of offenders, we do what's called high-risk, high-impact programming. They're the programming where it makes the offender accountable for their actions. It teaches them about consequences. There's all types of programs out there, and I've worked with the Connecticut Civil Liberties in putting these programs into place. It's easy to incorporate into the system. When you start having offenders that are in this population, you can't have any idle time. Everything has to be related around programming. The programming is, to me, when you're talking about this high-risk, a little education on high-risk impact programming, when you allow programs into offenders that we know have a history of violence, you don't want certain programs that have items they could use for violence. Allowing paintbrushes to you and I might be not a big deal. Well, they would start using these as weapons. Having things that they could use against themselves are dangerous items. Social skills, greatest impact it could do for these offenders. How you deal with offenders with even if they have personality disorders, which we're not considering under an SMI criteria. That's important for the staff and Department of Health to work on personality disorders, on how you socialize with other offenders. You do that in very large groups, you're not going to be successful. If you look at any school system around the country, how do they do social skills networking? Small individual groups. Could be one, then it becomes two, and then you work with small groups, not large groups, because it won't work. You can't put someone with a personality disorder in a group of 100 inmates and expect them to succeed. They're not gonna. So the programming will work around that. I have a great ideas. I'm bringing somebody in that's going to be now the Deputy Commissioner of Programs and Services that's going to bring all these things in that have done exactly what you already said. So they're good stuff.
Okay, just to follow up, I did have an opportunity. I appreciate all those papers that were submitted to the board in advance. Today I had an opportunity to read them all, including the letter from COBA. And in their letter, certainly in meetings with them, they told us that they really feel they need a lot more training to be able to deal in this dangerous environment, and especially in a unit where we're going to be putting our most dangerous, including crisis intervention, de-escalation, community skill building, being better trained as to mental health, and also that it would be very helpful to have steady assignments and not be on a wheel where an officer gets to know the inmates and comes into the unit knowing them, developing a relationship. Can you address those two issues?
Amen. That's exactly what I'm thinking too. You need the programming piece for, if we have the correction officers involved in a team programming approach, they have to be trained on how to do that. If we have the correction officers that are involved in the behavioral treatment plans in the process, they have to be trained in pieces of that. They have to understand it. Correction officers have to understand classification, what it means. What is it for behavioral, what is really a behavioral treatment plan? Officers should know all that. All that training is important, and I agree with you. It has to be part of it. You have to work as a team when you're dealing with a specialized population. The correction officer has to work together with a social worker to be able to do this. And everybody works as a team approach to make this happen, and you have to train somebody to do that.
Thank you, First Deputy Commissioner Brandon. Now we will hear from Martin
I
Murphy.
think we got the better part of this trade with the state of Connecticut, probably.
Our next speaker is Martin Murphy, Acting Chief of the Department, and then Commissioner Scott Temple from the Connecticut Department of Corrections.
Good morning, Chair Campbell. Good morning, Board. My name is Martin Murphy. I'm the Acting Chief of Department. I'm here this morning to take this opportunity to petition the Board of Correction to rule in favor of the proposed rule change that we, the New York City Department of Correction, seek regarding enhanced supervision housing. The proposed rule change will provide our department the opportunity to effectively manage those individuals committed to our custody who have been validated as influential gang members and those who have been found in possession of smuggled scalpel blades, along with those who have repeatedly assaulted and caused serious injury to both uniform and civilian staff, as well as other incarcerated individuals. Enhanced supervision is not punitive segregation and is not intended for the entire population. Only 10% of the inmates in custody engage in rule violation, and only 7% commit violent infractions. There will be only 250 beds committed for the use for enhanced supervision, which means that only 2.2% of the average daily population will be eligible for this type of housing at any time. All enhanced supervision inmates will have at least 7 hours of out-of-cell time per day, and all those enhanced supervision units will have access to all program services as those afforded to the general population. The Commission has identified a need for change in the culture at DOC, along with a need for a fundamental change in the way we do business. However, we cannot make substantial change without first having safer jail environments. Enhanced supervision housing is a step toward achieving those goals of a safer jail. Thank you.
Chief, I've read the Commissioner's multiple responses, including the latest response to our questions, and he specifically said in every one of these presentations, and it's going to fall on you because you're the chief, that there will be no additional training, that this are standard post officers, that there's no need for any additional training for these, for the staff working there. And I would also say that based on my experience on Rikers Island for the past 5 years, your ability to get steady posts is nil. It's been very important, and I don't know what you need to do that, and if there is something that the board can do to help you achieve that, that would be great. But I wish you could, I ask you again to respond to this, why there's no need for any additional training, that you're not asking for any additional funds for training for the
Well, I don't think that
everybody gets.
I don't think that's accurate, as the First Deputy Commissioner just said. Is the programming comes in and the training of the staff is absolutely essential for this type of.
But the Commissioner has told us repeatedly that these are standard post orders for working on these units, and no additional training is necessary.
In the enhanced supervision housing,
Yes.
staff that are on the post now receive the training to manage those units as we described. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chief Murphy. Our next speaker is Commissioner Temple from the Connecticut Department of Corrections, followed by Alexandria Ford. Commissioner.
Good morning. Happy holidays. Chairman Campbell and members of the New York City Board of Correction. My name is Scott Semple, and I'm the Interim Commissioner of the Connecticut Department of Correction. I'm pleased to appear before you today to discuss and support the concept of enhanced supervision housing. Our experience in Connecticut continues to prove the effectiveness of this type of initiative. In my testimony today, I hope to provide a brief history of our adoption of this type of housing, as well as some lessons learned from our implementation. Connecticut's correctional institutions faced significant staff and inmate safety challenges during the late 80s and early 1990s. Like many states, Connecticut embarked on an aggressive program of building infrastructure, which resulted in more than doubling the numbers of cells between 1993 and 1996. At the same time, we expanded our use of various restrictive housing programs. Our incident rates dropped, and our prisons became much safer places to work and live. As these conditions improved, we became acutely aware that our one-size-fits-all system of placing troublesome inmates in restriction may have exasperated our problems rather than solving them. We learned that vulnerable inmates often act out to be placed in restrictive housing if they feel they cannot live safely in a general population. We learned that inmates with moderate mental health issues are often utilized by security threat members, gang affiliations, to do the bidding of the leaders. And we learned that a surprisingly small percentage of offenders in general population cause disruption that leads to institutional unrest. As a result of this experience, Connecticut has developed a number of initiatives to address the specialized needs of these vulnerable or otherwise problematic populations. One example is our youth development unit at the Garner Correctional Facility in Newtown, Connecticut. A young inmate, generally one who is under the age of 21, who would otherwise qualify for a very restrictive housing status, either because of serious misconduct or as related to gang activity, is instead assigned to the youth development unit, where within a secure custodial setting, evidence-based programs and services, including education, mandatory education, are delivered in an age-appropriate manner, just as they would be in our general population. This arrangement has a dual benefit. First, we remove a small number of problematic and impulsive inmates from the population at our Manson Youth Institute located in Cheshire, thus improving the climate at that institution. Second, rather than strict segregation, we continue to target the conduct and programmatic interventions that will reduce the individual's likelihood of committing institutional misconduct, and if we do it correctly, we can impact recidivism. Another example of specific targeted intervention is our mental health housing units, also located at Garner and Newtown. Connecticut, like many other states, houses a significant number of inmates with moderate to severe mental illness. In Connecticut, I believe the number, I think I heard today, was 30%. In Connecticut, we marked 18%. Not only do these inmates require appropriate clinical care, their behavior is often problematic. In an attempt to meet the needs of this vulnerable population, the department has created several housing units at the Garner facility which deliver mental health and rehabilitative services in a secure atmosphere that is not a general population setting. Again, access to programs is equal or better than afforded in population. The limitation is only access to other inmates who may take advantage of the vulnerability of the mentally ill. It is appropriate here to acknowledge several lessons learned. First, as I mentioned, one size does not fit all when it comes to reducing disruption, trauma, and violence associated with prison life. Specialized housing units like the one I have discussed today are part of a continuum that includes more or less restrictive housing statuses. Second, when developing housing units and individualized management plans, we have found that a multidisciplinary approach is best. Unit teams include custody, case management, treatment, supervisory management, and clinical staff in order to address the needs of the inmate and reduce disconnections. Finally, flexibility is paramount. Often problematic inmates face disciplinary sanctions which may have lost any relationship to deterrence or behavior modification. We've had inmates who have faced loss of visits and other privileges for multiple years. Our specialized units attempt to build a system of incentives for improved behavior by modifying or eliminating sanctions based on positive behavior in compliance with a behavior management plan. Small positive changes are rewarded. Small changes can lead to larger changes. I'm proud of what Connecticut has done to improve the safety of its facilities and reduce associated trauma significantly for staff and offenders. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Commissioner Semple. Any questions?
Based on what you've heard about what has been proposed here in New York City, are there any recommendations that you have concerning the implementation? Anything that you see as necessary to enhance the effectiveness of this? or any concerns about what you've heard?
So, what I try to influence in Connecticut, corrections in general, is used to kind of black and white policy-driven initiatives, and strategies such as this are gray. So, in terms of the time,
Is it great or gray?
gray.
Okay.
Could be great. But a couple things that I heard today when you talked about programs. First, programs are great, and they can be evidence-based and have all the things that go along with that. But it's really about the passionate facilitation of those programs that makes an impact. It's a connection with the offender that actually makes them make a decision to their betterment. So in terms of the programs, you can list the programs, you can identify the programs, you can change the programs. But those programs need to come from facilitators who have the capacity to influence that offender to do the right thing. So that is one important thing. What was the other part? Can you just...
I'm just asking whether or not there are any things that you've heard that raise any concerns, so that you want us to pay particular attention to something you just mentioned.
So I think that what I heard today was a very positive thing in terms of, I heard taking a team approach, and I had mentioned some of the concentrations of staff titles that we use for that purpose. I think that that is absolutely necessary. And what you find is, in order to operate programs like this, you need to ensure that you have a safe environment. But you also have to have respect for the other concentrations of staff that are necessary for these types of units to be successful. So that team approach and understanding each other's disciplines and responsibilities is absolutely valuable for these things to be successful.
Thank you, Commissioners.